Welcome to Dear Marketers, produced by MKT1 and Caspian Studios in partnership with Typeform. Hi, Jenny. Hi, Devon. We're here on episode 2 of Dear Marketers. I'm still Emily Kramer, and I have two friends here with me today. I guess they're my dear friends, I should say. We have Devon Watts, who is the brand new, as of this month, head of product marketing and partnerships at Mercury. She's also had the pleasure of working with me twice, both at Asana and Carta. And she's also been a head of marketing as well, most recently at Anrock. So she brings lots of knowledge and greatness. She's coming to us live from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Indeed. Let's hope I bring greatness. We'll see.
We'll see. I'll let you know at the end. And we
I'm
have,
sure you will.
I know. And we have Jenny Tai back for episode 2. She's the head of content at Vanta, and she's the former hiring reference for Devon. That's complicated to say. Jenny was the person I called to do a reference on Devon when I hired her, and then I said that reference call was so good, we have to hire Jenny too.
It's like a professional meet cute.
Yeah, it is a professional meet cute.
Yeah, Jenny and I had worked together at Yammer, the original professional social network, enterprise social network, actually. Created that category, no big deal. And then again at Asana, and then, yeah, Emily and I had to repeat from Asana to Carta.
Another meet cute. Something like that.
I don't think I know what that is.
I don't either. That's why I'm using it incredulously. Let's go to Typeform for today's question.
Dear marketers, hello, I'm Michaela. I'm head of marketing at Tracksuit. We do beautiful, affordable, always-on brand tracking. Now, content is the heart of our marketing engine. So I've got a question for you, Emily. What is your best advice for telling a consistent story across channels?
Thanks, Michaela, for asking that question. Let's get some initial reactions from Devon and Jenny. Anything you think of right away when Michaela so eloquently asked her question about telling her story?
Yeah, I can jump in first. I think it's a great question, first of all, and one that I love to think about. When you're thinking about story in a broad sense like this across channels, programs, activities, I think the first thing I would say is to remember that your story is not just your product story. And I'm a product marketer saying that. So your product is amazing, hopefully. But if you only talk about your product, people are going to get bored pretty quickly. So think more expansively than that.
Yeah, or you're going to limit, like more than people getting bored, you're going to limit the amount of potential interactions. There are other things you can talk about. So I think about it as like, I'll get more into this, but if you think about like, you know, a huge circle, that's your brand story, like product story is just a little tiny concentric circle within it. I don't know if it's concentric. It can be any shape. It's just a blob within the bigger brand story. That looks better in a diagram form than out loud, but here we are. Jenny, what's your initial thought for Michaela?
My hot take response is what not to do, which is don't just start cranking out content and creative and marketing assets if you haven't aligned on what your big picture themes are, because I think that's a very easy way to just get into doing random acts of marketing that aren't cohesive or consistent.
Yeah, it actually goes back to episode 1, which is about handling multiple marketing requests or requests for multiple teams for marketing. And one of the big things that we were talking about that happens is just lots of teams are going to request things from you. And that's especially true on sort of the content and asset side of things because marketing, has the content team and the design team and all of this. And so making sure you know what the themes are is a great way to be able to prioritize those ideas and also make sure people understand what you're doing and why you're not maybe writing about their brilliant idea. I think the last thing I'll say here is I think of content overall or your story or your brand, content, story, and brand as another product your company's creating for the same audience. So it's a product. It should be thought of as a product. Managed like a product, you need to think about why you're telling your story, what's unique about your story, how your story is differentiated from competitor stories, much like you would think about how your product is going to be differentiated. So you need to think of it and approach it as a product with like that level of intentionality, I believe. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, Typeform. Typeform has been my default form builder for years, and it's essential in any marketer's stack. We even use a Dear Marketers branded Typeform to gather questions from you, our listeners, for each episode of this podcast. And you can also use Typeform to build forms that capture leads, gather feedback, do customer research, collect testimonials, or even field requests from other teams. And you can sync and connect your results to other tools with their 120 plus integrations. Use code MKT1 to get 20% off their annual growth plan. So with that, I think the best way to structure this, I think we've all like been throwing out some synonyms. We've been a little bit like thesaurus-y here with like brand, story, content. So we should probably define what story is. That might be helpful. Nobody said this in the popcorn segment we just did, which is what we call this internally. That was the popcorn segment, where we popcorned around. But we want to talk about crafting perceptions, which is what we all do to make story concrete. We write something called perceptions. So we'll talk about those. And then I think we should talk about how we create content and campaigns based on those perceptions. Anything that I missed that you all want to cover?
Sounds like a plan to me.
Let's do it.
And so first up, what the F is story?
I was going to ask you, Kramer, how would you define story?
Way to flip it back. I think of story as, I think there's a few components to your story. Like you're saying, it's not just the product story, although that's part of it. To me, story is really like everything you say about your business. And that includes the stuff you say about like your company mission, vision, your founding story. It includes the stuff you say about your product. It includes the things you say related to thought leadership. It includes the things you say in ad copy and all of that. Like all of that together is your story. So maybe the story is the through line across all of your marketing fuel. And you want to shape that story. What you don't want to happen is to say a whole bunch of random things and then have people not know what the story is. And so the through lines, whether you're defining them or other people are trying to define them across all of the marketing fuel, I think is your story.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think also like you do have different audiences at, any company, right? You have your customers, probably the most important audience and the one we think about most as marketers, but your recruiting team has an audience of candidates, prospective employees. You have investors, you have these other audiences that you might want to tell slightly different stories to, but still have a consistent through line and still be sort of telling the market at large, a unified story.
So is story brand? Is brand story? Is it the same?
Before we get to that, I was going to say, I do really like the definition of story as being very broad. And I think the key point is that piece around the consistent through line. Often what I see at companies that I've worked with is it is missing that consistent through line, right? So it's like we have messaging for, this line of products and then messaging for this audience. And what's often missing is there isn't like a cohesive understanding about how all the parts fit together and ladder up to something bigger. So I think the story encompasses all those different aspects of what you're telling the market.
And if you, as marketer at company, don't know what the through line is, you should know that, like, the through line that people get in their head is probably going to be a mess. Like, if you don't know it, nobody else is
know
gonna
it, then your audience won't.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so is story the same thing as brand?
I'm going to give a yes and answer.
Oh, my favorite kind of answer.
Story is brand, but brand isn't just story.
Yes.
Because brand is everything else. Brand is also your product. It's your, customer support experiences.
Yeah.
It's all of it.
Brand is all the interactions, I would say.
Yeah.
Interactions with your company, all of that together ladders up to your brand, which I think story is a little more tied to like the fuel, the words, the things you say. I mean, naturally. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I think story is more like the things you say and brand is more like how you say it.
Oh. Well, that's a whole other topic. This is getting deep.
Brand is what you say and how you say it. But story isn't really how you could tell the same story in a very different way with different sort of brand attributes behind it. I think the story can be told quite differently. But the story is fundamental to sort of the brand that you develop as well, right?
So what you're saying is like maybe two companies could have the same story, but doesn't mean they're going to have the same brand. Which is basically like what we're saying, which is like, I think we can agree that story is a subset of brand, not the other way around. And then I can't tell if Devon has like the best definition of brand ever, or is just like overthinking and confusing people. So I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of that, because this isn't about what is brand. I don't think I ever want to tackle what is brand as a whole podcast episode. That would be like, whew. I would need like a couple hour nap after that. And I just don't usually have time for that in my day as much as I wish I did. All right. So then how is story, and so story is a subset of brand. How does positioning fit into story? I don't know what I'm doing with my hands if you're watching the video version of this.
I mean, I think product positioning is kind of a subset of your story, right? Your product story is a subset of your overall company story, and then your product positioning is almost even more specific than your product story. And yeah, but I do think you need to have a really consistent product positioning statement too, right? And a one-liner that you socialize really well across the company that everyone can repeat. But that one-liner about it's probably about what your product does mainly and who it's for, that is not your story, and that is not the only way to get story consistency, as we'll get into here.
Right. So positioning is not a blueprint for your story. Positioning is a blueprint for how you differentiate yourself in the market. And I would say your product story is a larger thing than your positioning, in fact, because there could be multiple kind of things you want to say about your product that maybe most of them ladder up to positioning, but some of them might not really be around that differentiation. I don't know. So to me, positioning is a subset of product story, and product story is a subset of overall story. We're going to put a diagram in the show notes for this for sure.
Probably fits in a pyramid or a reverse pyramid.
I think it's a dodecahedron. I don't even know what that is. But
I don't know that shape.
I don't know. It's a shape for sure. Well, I think the point here is that I think we've driven this home between Devon and I. Product is just one part of your overall story, but you need to think of your story as a product, just to confuse things. Okay, I think we're good on story. Anything anybody else wants to say about like what is this nebulous story thing?
The other piece I'll add is when you think about all the different kind of components to your overall story and the relationships between those different components, whether it's product story, positioning, and then getting into the actual messaging. I think it often helps to think about it in terms of altitude or levels of granularity. So your overall kind of company story is going to be pretty broad. Maybe it's going to get into your mission and why you exist. And then as you get more specific around your products and your offerings, you're going to get much more detailed. And then depending on the context and where you're, kind of delivering or distributing that specific aspect of your story, it's really just going to depend on, goals and kind of your audience segment. So again, it's helpful to know how all the different pieces and layers fit together.
So now you're saying the diagram is mountain shaped.
Yes.
All right. So what's the best way to codify or to get alignment around and drive consistency around your story?
I would say start with what you want people to hear, basically. And one exercise for this is, what would you want people to repeat back to you about, your company? And this gets to this perceptions exercise on, really honing in on what are the one or two or, three or less things that you really want your audience to be saying about you. And that, I think, helps you really build kind of the pillars for your story.
So you think there should be 3 or less?
I do. 3 or fewer?
I mean,
Kramer convo. We could sidebar
it's 3
on
or
that
it's
forever.
3 or fewer, but that's not the point of this conversation. Less is like sand and fewer is like objects, if we're getting into the grammar, I think.
I knew you would explain it.
Yeah.
You couldn't help yourself.
I couldn't. I was like, I have an analogy for this. You wouldn't say fewer sand because it's unquantifiable when it's quantifiable. Anyway, see, I am a nerd.
I don't know. I think you probably need 2 or 3, right? If you only have one key story to tell, again, I think you might find yourself a bit limited. And I just think
Or
it's
it's
unlikely
just not helpful
that,
because that story
yeah,
would have to be so broad. I only say that because I actually think it's fine to have like 3 to 5 storylines. Usually I think like 3 to 4 is the magic number. But I think, I think over 5 is too many. 3 is probably the magic number. 1 is definitely too little. So, but I wouldn't be so prescriptive. It's whatever number of storylines you need, or I'm sort of conflating these two words of storylines and perception. So let's define this a little bit. A perception is what you want the market to say about you and what you want people to think and say. And so effectively, you're writing your storylines from the perspective of your audience. So instead of saying, we are the best AI agent for X, you would say it from the perspective of a potential customer. Like, oh, Dinosaur Co. is the best AI agent for X, or Dinosaur Co. is the obvious choice for X. So I like to write them, and I think you both do too, like to write them from the perspective of a customer. So you really get into the minds of like, what do you want people to say and think about you? So you're coming up with these from a customer perspective, not a company-centric perspective.
Yeah, it reminds me of an exercise I often do with product launches, which is like write the headline we would want to see. If we got our dream PR placement or whatever, but how would they realistically put it? Not just like what's going to be our blog post headline or our landing page headline, because that is not necessarily kind of how the market will perceive or talk about you.
I think it helps you tell more interesting or create more interesting things too when you're thinking about it from that perspective, because it tends to be more in human speak that way versus like your buzzwordy jargon-y speech too.
Mm-hmm.
I also like rating perceptions from the perspective of the customer that you're trying to reach, because then it helps you think about actually where they are right now. Like, do they even think about you? If not, then like you actually have to create some awareness. Or if there is an existing perception about you, then what do you need to do to shift it to the new perception?
Right. You also like, or do they think about this trend? Or like, are they even aware of this trend that's happening? Or are they even like, do they even care about people's opinions on X? Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Putting it in their perspective makes you think about where they are already on this in a way that, like, I think people often forget that their company thinks about this topic so much more than everybody else. And so it's a good way to get out of that trap. So a little bit more about perceptions. When you write these things, you're writing like, 2 to 5 statements. They should be opinionated, and they should then guide your marketing efforts so that you can tell a repeatable story and focus your story. Anything to add to that definition?
I think just that, and I said this at the top, but they shouldn't all be necessarily about your product, right? These can be driven by market trends or new audiences you're trying to capture, or things about your company culture or sort of like philosophy that you think are going to be really interesting to the market and are core to sort of successfully.
Things your customers have in common. Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to, when I help people write perceptions, which is something I used to do when I was teaching courses and stuff. So I've seen a lot of people try to write perceptions, like hundreds of people. And I used to say, oh, well, they typically fall into the categories of like trends in your market and commonalities between your customers or audience insights and product insights. And then people would go and they would follow this formulaically and write a perception for each of those things exactly. And I think that's not correct, because what's most important to your company might not fall in those categories, but like for some guidance, those could be the categories that they fall into. But I think a better way to think of perceptions are, what are the questions, if you were to run an exercise to get to these perceptions, which when you do that, it should include founders, product leaders, other leaders in the company in the brainstorm, not in the final wordsmithing of perceptions, because that's going to be a nightmare. If you like crowdsource final wording of things, nightmare. But crowdsourcing, sort of getting people's feelings on these storylines and what's important, I think should be a group effort exercise. And so what are some of the questions that you think are useful to ask to like get people to these perceptions? So let's say, Jenny, you're running this exercise. You've brought together a founder, maybe a product leader, maybe you have a customer success leader. You have, your head of marketing, you as the head of content are doing this. What are some things you would ask?
Well, I think even just trying to figure out which category of perceptions to rate starts with what are the biggest business needs and priorities are for the company at the moment. So if we're feeling, I don't know, a lot of competitive pressure, then maybe we want to start digging into, okay, what do we want our audience to think about our product? How are we going to get people to think about our product in a differentiated way? If the company is trying to do our favorite thing, create a category, what's happening in the in the market or the industry that we want to kind of, I can't believe I'm saying this word, disrupt. So I think you have to, start with, the business goals and the marketing objectives, and then, kind of ask the right questions from there.
I actually think there's a give and take, though, between setting your marketing objectives. Like, what comes first, setting your marketing objectives or perceptions? And I actually think that there's a give and take there. Like, you need to iterate on them together, because sometimes your perceptions are going to then cause you to say, we need to do this campaign, or we need to get this out in the market, which then might become like a goal or objective, right? So you got to take into account objectives, but then recognize that perceptions are such a powerful, important thing for your company that maybe they'll shape some objectives too.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, like, perceptions should be pretty lasting, right? Like, perceptions take time to actually create in the market, right? To actually get
You're
people
manipulating minds, so
yeah, and that takes
like to use the word
time and repetition.
influencing.
And I think this is part of where the question comes from, right? Like, how do we keep these things consistent over time across channels so that we actually get this story across to people, right? The story actually comes through. So when thinking about an exercise, I would say, think on a medium to long-term time horizon in terms of what, the product vision is, where the business is headed. Those big pieces, like, don't limit yourself to here's where we want to be in the next 6 months. This can be really hard at an early stage startup because you don't even necessarily know where you want or need to be in 12 to 24 months. But, to the extent possible, try to think of this as, akin to kind of a visioning exercise, because I think that will get you to sort of the essence of things.
It's not like what are the monthly topics you're writing about. It's
Yes,
broader than that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So to that end, some of my favorite questions that I've asked, I've not only have I done this, like, had people do this in my course, but I've also do this with most companies that I advise. And so the questions that I tend to like to ask are things that are very visiony, to your point, Devon. Like, how will the world change if your company is super successful? Like, literally, like, what will change about how people work? Why is your team uniquely suited to build this company? Like, what about your team makes it so you can win here? A lot of these questions actually are things that investors ask when they're investing in companies too. These are high level questions. But you can also think of, like, well, what is going to push your next X number of customers, or your next, if you double revenue, what is the thing that pushes those customers over the line? Or another one I like is, what is a product decision you're making as a company that, like, maybe competitors aren't making? Like, what's an opinionated thing you're doing in the product? And so can you all think of an example of that, like, at Asana?
Yes, one assignee.
One
the
assignee.
Famous one assignee per task. So yeah, we used to get a lot of user feedback at Asana on people wanting to be able to have more than one owner or assignee on a single task object, and that was just, like, fundamentally antithetical to the sort of purpose of Asana, which is clarity, right, on who's doing what by when. And if you have two people attached to one task, you don't know which one of them is doing it by that due date.
And you need to make a subtask or make a project or make a different unit. And so that, like, can be a perception. Like, tasks need a clear owner, tasks need a DRI. Tasks won't get done if they don't have a DRI. And so that's core to everything about the Asana product and also the Asana philosophy on working. Another company I've been thinking a lot about recently is this CRM called Adio. We use them at Market One, and they're a new CRM, and it's sort of like a future modern CRM that doesn't look exactly like HubSpot or Salesforce. And so their opinion there is actually that enrichment should be built into the CRM. When you add a person, it should just automatically fill out all the information about them. It shouldn't be an add-on. It should be native to how it works. And so that's like could be their perception is basically like, the CRM should do the work for you of enriching everything and building out your list. It shouldn't just be you recording information that you already have.
Yeah, it's like things you have a really strong perspective on as a company, either from a product lens or from a company building lens or something like that, can make good perceptions and interesting stories to tell.
Let me throw out one more for Typeform, which is our partner in this podcast, conveniently. Their original thing is like forms don't have to look the way they always have with like a boring little form field stacked up. Like they don't have to be ugly. They can be this like beautiful, delightful experience to fill out. So that could be one for them. I think the only thing we haven't really talked about is how do you get to like the market trends type perceptions? And so those are things like, are you part of like a movement or a state change in the industry? Like right now, like obviously you could see companies saying, oh yeah, like everyone's like agents are going to be how we get work done. And so we're part of that trend. So I think asking things like what's changing in the market that we're a part of.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to not only understanding people's current perceptions of you and your brand and your company, but of the space that you operate in too, right? So knowing kind of what your audience is thinking and feeling about products like yours, or even just like that job to be done that your product solves, can help you kind of get at what are the trends or things that are actually relevant to them, right? Because the other thing with trends is it's really easy to just hop on to something that is trending and try to, sort of artificially attach your company to it. And if that's not, the thing is that could be top of mind for like media or like on social, but if it's not top of mind and important for your customer or your core audience, then it shouldn't necessarily
Don't
go
force
into your
it.
perceptions.
Don't force it. That's the other thing with perceptions and marketing in general. Like, don't force it. Like, if it doesn't make sense for your company but could make sense for a competitor, like, you shouldn't force it. Like, it has to feel like natural to what you're doing and to the stories you can tell and the people you have to tell those stories. And so just because it's a great perception for a company like yours doesn't mean it should be one of yours, if that makes sense.
Your perceptions can definitely reinforce each other, right? So if you have a perception about your product, that can also be related to and reinforce a perception about a trend or insight and vice versa. So if we were to use Adio for an example, and they, let's say, have a product perception about enrichment being native to the product, that could reinforce another perception around an insight that sales and go-to-market teams need, data at their fingertips to do their jobs well.
Yeah, agreed. They should go together. And in fact, the combination of your perceptions should be unique to your company. Like no other company should be able to claim that no other company should be able to claim that combination is like a test I use for if these perceptions are good. And one individual perception could potentially be used by many other companies, but that combination should feel like uniquely your company, or else your story is not going to seem unique, really is what it comes down to. Closing Media is a boutique agency that runs LinkedIn and Google campaigns for growth stage startups. I worked with them in-house back in 2018 and still personally recommend them to my advisees. Because they're a team of two, they can quickly plug in as an extension of your team and process. And they're also obsessed with performance and have the experience to know what's going to work on these channels. Reach out at closingmedia.com and mention Dear Marketers to get $5,000 of free ad spend on your next campaign. All right, I want to do something quickly just because I know from experience in talking about perceptions, like people are still like, well, tell me them. What are they? And so we thought we would do some famous slogans or statements in marketing, and then we'll try to think about what's the perception that might have led to this slogan. This will make more sense when we do it. And this might seem like a game, but we actually have a game at the end too. So this is just a bonus game right here. So it's like a warm-up game, and then the game at the end, I actually pick a winner between the two of you. So there's no winner in this one. The winner are the listeners, really. The listeners are the winners. All right, so let's take the slogan apples, think different. What might have been the perception, if they had written perceptions, behind think different?
I think the perception that they wanted to land is that Apple is for creative types and thinkers, and creative in a broad sense, not just like designers and such. But basically, and if you think about that broader ad campaign around it, it was all about like iconoclasts and people who were like, doing innovative new things in the market. So and really what they were trying to do is differentiate from PCs, right? And so what I really love about this slogan is that I don't think a lot of people realize that for the longest time, IBM's slogan was just think. So think different is a very literal just slogan to differentiate from IBM.
Look at this deep knowledge on
Jenny loves IBM marketing. Fun fact.
I do.
Yeah.
Well, I like their
Knows
fonts.
a lot about
they have
it.
great fonts.
Yeah.
So I like, this isn't the question. The question wasn't like, do I like this slogan? But the grammar gets me, but I think that's part of the point. I don't think the perception was like, let's use bad grammar to get people's attention. As we've learned in this podcast, I care about grammar. It's a lot of grammar talk today. But the point here is yeah, I think it's think different from the PC. So it could be like, we need to stand out from the PC. It could be, to Jenny's point, we are for creatives, which could then lead to a whole bunch of other ideas on showcasing who's using them and what those people are and making sure all those people are like creative and whatnot.
Well, and that same perception then got carried through into subsequent ad campaigns, like the I'm a PC versus I'm a Mac.
Which was like years later.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I remember that. All right. Let's do another one. Twilio, which at the time, their main product was they had an API or an SDK for you to add messaging to your product. So instead of having to build messaging capabilities, you could just plug in Twilio. And so that's the context. But the thing they had on all their billboards, and I think they still do like 10 years later, is ask your developer. What do we think the perception behind that was?
I'll take a stab at this one. I think the perception may have been written something like every developer knows Twilio or uses Twilio. So that perception of like mass awareness / adoption with a very specific persona. I think the implication here is if you ask your developer about Twilio, they will know something about it.
Be awkward if you did and the developer's like, I have no idea.
That would be awkward.
Yeah, I think there's also something like, this is a situation where it's like a build versus buy. Are the developers going to build this themselves or buy it? And I think it's kind of like saying, and I don't know this. I'm not a developer marketer, but I don't know if it's sort of like, hey, it's cool. Like developers are using this. This is something we're fine talking about. Like, it isn't a secret that we're using these these APIs. We don't have to build it ourselves. We can do this. So I think it's almost a little like it's an everybody's doing it, but I think there's more of like a loaded context behind it, which is like,
You don't have to hide this from your dev team
yeah,
kind of thing. Okay.
or like
So-
this is a way to be a great developer. This is a path. But I don't know what I think you're still right. The perception is all developers are starting to know what Twilio is, and so. But I think there's a little bit of an undertone of like, it doesn't make you a bad developer to use something like this, but maybe I'm wrong. We'd have to go back in time and ask. All right, we're going to do two more. The next one we're going to do is wild card, got milk. Jenny, what do you think the perception behind got milk might have been?
You need milk all the time. I don't know.
Do you have milk?
Yeah. Milk is important? No, I think
Wasn't this so? I feel like we need context here. I know this is really a thought exercise, but wasn't there like something like juice was really taken off back?
yes. No, for
the
real.
Goblin soda.
Juice was
I think
having a moment. This was
yeah,
like in
they
the
were like trying to
late 80s.
regain market share.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Because perceptions are all about the moment, and so that was the moment. Juice was having a moment,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it was a consortium, big word, of farmers, I believe, that put this together. Like the milk union. I don't know, whatever. It probably wasn't a union. Doesn't matter. The milk community put this together, and yeah, it was trying to gain market share. But I think the point was like, the perception could be like, milk is in everyone's fridge, or milk needs to be in your fridge at all times. Like, you still need to be picking up milk when you go out, like.
Yeah, I think it's something like that.
Okay,
Like,
let me try that again. I think it's the perception is milk is a beverage for all occasions, including the ones that you aren't thinking about. I'm thinking about the Got Milk commercials. Because
Yes.
I think the perception was that milk is just something you have to drink to, keep growing.
Oh, so people want to drink it.
Yes, exactly.
Not me. Didn't work for
oh,
me.
like someone's gonna come over and be like, "Got milk?" And if you don't, bad
Oh,
news.
I had a coworker who asked for milk at bars, and I lost a lot of respect. I was like, do you have a child with you that you need to give this to? Like, what's happening? All right, we have gone off the rails. I like it. All right. So how do you know if perceptions are good? I would say some of the perceptions that we just reverse engineered were good and some were not good. But I think we've talked about a little bit about this already, about how do you know if perceptions are good? Well, I think the combined set of them needs to be unique to your company. What else makes them good versus terrible?
Can you remember what they are? And this maybe is why I tend toward 3 or fewer, because I just. Well, again, I think, it does depend probably on just sort of like the scope of your company and your audience and stuff like that. You might need more than that, but it just gets, I think, easier to get off track and inconsistent the more different ones you have. Not necessarily because people can't remember them, but it's sort of like they need to be like embedded in, the marketing team at the very least, and preferably sort of across the company. So yeah, memorable, simple enough to remember.
Short, simple, pithy, to the point. You should be able to,
Yeah. I actually like to try to represent each perception with an emoji. I'm not even joking. Like to put an emoji in front of it, because for me, I remember visuals and pictures like so much better. But if it can be simplified by an emoji, so everyone's like, oh yeah, it's the deer emoji. Is there a deer emoji? I don't know. If you're listening, the podcast is called Dear Marketers, so I now have a fake deer head on my wall as a pun. So I was trying to make that happen, but anyway, you can cut this out. So like maybe it's like the bee emoji, because it's about how busy everyone is. I don't know, but if it can be broken down and remembered in something like that, that's great, because I think every time you're writing content, writing a brief for that content, or even prioritizing work, you should put what perception that thing ladders up to. And the vast majority of your content, with maybe the exception of some SEO content, or some say like sales enablement content, but definitely like your thought leadership content, most of your product content should ladder up to one of these perceptions. And so knowing them off the cuff is essential for this to work. And so whatever you need to do to make them memorable, put an emoji on them, make them short, make them pithy. We had them like printed out, I believe, at Asana, but we were all in the same office, and we like to put weird things on the walls. So
Even for SEO content, some perceptions could be
Yeah.
relevant as a through line. That was definitely the case at Asana. It was super helpful to have the perceptions, and we would just, kind of pepper that in as appropriate.
Yeah. All right. So how do you then use this in practice? So we're starting to talk about how you use this in practice. Like you put the perception that it's laddering up to, say, like in the brief, or using that as a goal. Like we're going to drive this perception. But how do you use these to say create content roadmaps, create campaigns? How do you do it?
In a really tactical sense, you kind of mentioned that earlier. You literally, for every piece of content you write or as you're putting together campaign briefs, you want to clearly lay out, okay, which perception does this ladder up to? And then as you're building out, let's say, a content or editorial roadmap, you'll want to think through kind of like your content mix through the lens of your perception. So if you have 3 to 5, like what percentage of your content is going to be devoted to each perception?
To each one. Yeah. You can even like rank sort of the order or the amount of time you plan to spend kind of on each. I like doing things like that.
I think also though, your perceptions, the different perceptions will kind of show up heavier or lighter in different places, right? If you have one of your perceptions is maybe more product focused, that's going to be something you think a lot about in your product launch communications and on your web copy and maybe ad copy. Whereas if some of them are more kind of company culture or sort of company ethos related, maybe there's a bigger sort of PR program around that with exec speaker bureau and those kinds of things. So think about sort of the story channel fit as well. And, where is your audience sort of in what mindset are they in when they're coming to whatever property or piece of content or ad it is? And then what is the right perception to be trying to drive at that moment?
Yeah. And like back to something I said a while ago, I was saying how you're writing perceptions and you're writing your goals and there's a little bit of a give and take. I actually think that when you're in like a planning process for what your team's going to work on, you should take each perception that you've set. Like, let's say you're setting perceptions on sort of an annual basis, or maybe every 6 months if you're earlier stage. Maybe they don't change all those every time, but you at least evaluate them. Then I like to make sort of like a roadmap for how you're going to drive that perception. So almost thinking about that perception as a product you're selling or something you're launching. It's like, what's the plan, the campaign plan, the launch plan, the plan to launch this perception into the world? What are the campaigns? What are all the things that you're doing? And I find that some of the best marketing ideas like come from this because you're in a guardrail, which is the perception that you're trying to drive, but you're free to just think about tons of ideas within it. And so mapping that often leads to way better, or mapping the action plan towards driving that often lends itself to way better content ideas than just like, let's make an editorial calendar. So I like to really like run through and say like, well, if we were going all in on driving this perception, let's brainstorm all the things we could do. I find that a really great way to make creative marketing plans.
Yeah, I think one example of that is, let's say you want to drive a perception around your customer momentum, like you want to show like social proof and that a lot of like really great brands are choosing your product. You could then think through all the ways that you can, surface customers in your marketing and not just in terms of case studies, but how would you pull through your customers in ad campaigns or out of home or, thought leadership?
Yeah. So thinking through how does this impact lots of different touch points and lots of different channels and not just like the long form content you're making.
Right. Because at the end of the day, the perception is like the overall impression you want your audience to come away with. And that's going to be, the sum of all the touch points that they encounter.
So we've gone way down this rabbit hole of what are perceptions? How do you set them? As I recall, Michaela's question was not, how do you set perceptions? It was, how do you tell this clear and consistent story? So what's the final answer? If you had to do this in 1 or 2 sentences, what's the final clear answer for her? And for everybody else listening.
I think know what perceptions you want people to have of your company. So whether or not you actually go through a formal sort of perceptions writing exercise is probably less important necessarily than just starting from that framework of thinking about what is it that we want people to say about us in, however long a time frame, and then focus your content and campaigns around creating those perceptions.
Yeah, Jenny, anything to add there? I think I'll kind of mirror my answer at the beginning, which is don't do stuff or don't start doing marketing until you've laid out what those perceptions are, because I think that's just going to create more chaos and noise than is going to be helpful.
Yeah. If you don't know your story, you probably won't be telling a good one. So know your story, define it, spend time to actually define what you're trying to say Not in terms of individual content pieces or things like that. Like go zoom a level out, like Jenny's saying, and figure that out. It's time. While it might seem like I don't have the time to do that, I just need to jump in and write like or I need to create, or I need to make this video. Like your work is going to be so much better if you take a couple steps backwards in order to like go much faster and, with a much more clear sense of direction. So that's my take.
It's helpful for like decision making and giving feedback and stuff like that on things too, right? It's kind of like, does this drive this perception effectively? So yeah, it might feel like slowing down now, but I think it can actually help speed up execution once you're in it, because everyone's aligned on those perceptions and you can use it as a kind of a guiding light for the things that you do, which, if no one's clear on what you're trying to say, then reviews for content roadmaps and campaign strategies get really muddled, because everyone's like, what are we actually trying to do here beyond the metrics KPIs, right? What do we actually want people to think after they experience this campaign becomes so much clearer, and you can move a lot faster because of that.
Naro is an AI content platform to connect sales conversations with your content strategy. Based on actual recorded sales conversations, Naro's AI identifies the most needed sales enablement and marketing content, and then actually helps you create it. From blog posts to battle cards, your content will hit the mark, not just with your sales team, but also with your prospects. Could this be the beginning of a perfect sales and marketing relationship? I hope so. Get your first month of Naro free. Visit narohq.com/MKT1. Now it's time for Best Marketer, where I quiz my co-hosts. I am going to give you a perception. This is actually a perception I think could make sense for Tracksuit, the company Michaela works at. They are a brand measurement tool. And so an obvious perception for them might be brand is actually measurable. And a lot of people might think that it's not measurable. It's harder to measure. But one of their perceptions could be brand is measurable. Okay, so where is the game in this? The game is I want to hear your best ideas for how they can drive this perception. Brand is measurable. Go.
Okay, I'm going to go first. I think they could do two things. One is basically release a brand measurement template or calculator or some sort of interactive tool based on kind of what they've, just based on their own data and use it as like a lead magnet for prospects to, start thinking about brand measurement for themselves. And then the other is potentially release like, like a yearly biannual report on kind of like brand benchmarks that they've gleaned from, their customer base.
Awesome. Okay. I'm considering this. I'm not going to give any opinions until you're done.
Also my idea.
Well, you got to think of another one now. You can go. We're going to have another.
Pivot.
We have two. There's 2 rounds in this game, so you'll get to go first on round 2.
Okay.
Best Marketer. Yeah.
Great. No, I'll sort of pivot or tweak that maybe. Like I like the idea of like some kind of site you could go to, again, interactive kind of like tool, but you could put in brands that you know and like, or brands that compete with one another, and sort of see how they like stack up against each other.
Like Google Trends back in the day, but better.
Yeah. But it could also be like not just awareness or like traffic or whatever, but it could be perception, how are they perceived in the market, or sort of like what is the like overall sentiment around that brand or something. So you could do like, I don't know, Taco Bell versus KFC, except they're the same now.
Do you know that you weren't on the first episode of the podcast, but I know you listened to it in detail. So it's funny that you said Taco Bell, because after our first episode, we said we can never talk about Taco Bell again. So I guess you didn't get the memo.
No, this was just me trolling you and talking about Taco Bell again anyway.
Oh, okay. You did know.
We're all such fans of Taco Bell marketing.
What's the perception for Liv Moss?
More Taco Bell talk. No
your
more
life is
tacoing
Manos.
about it.
Liv Moss.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to give the first round actually to Devon, because I like the idea of showing measurements for actual brands. Like saying brand is so easy to measure that we can actually measure it for random companies ourselves. Like we can put a measure on this. And so let's compare these brands. I think putting it on brands people know and being able to share assets related to those brands and how you would measure brand awareness for those just brings it to life. And then maybe those companies will share it too. So I think that's a good idea because it has some more distribution baked into it. So I'm going to give point 1 to Devon, even though she had to go second. But there's one more perception. And this is a perception I could imagine for, we're using Riverside to record this. And like, I could imagine this for Riverside. I don't know if it's one, but they could have a perception that's anyone can record a podcast. Devon, what's your best idea for how they could turn that into content campaigns, activate that perception?
I mean, it might be just handing this one to Jenny on a silver platter, but because my best idea is a really bad one, which is like have a bunch of like random people record podcasts.
And feature them, like feature
Make
podcasts from just the most
feature-
random, incapable people.
Maybe like a baby podcast. Just a bunch of babies. Yep, that's my idea. A baby podcast.
Okay. So a
My
bunch of-
idea, okay, I had a very similar idea, but I'm going to pivot.
You had a similar idea to a baby podcast?
Just like regular people recording podcasts. Okay, so my pivot is Boucle is going to record a podcast.
Okay, so
Pet
dog
podcast.
podcast.
Yeah, dog podcast.
Okay. Well, there's an obvious winner here because this is going to sound mean, but I'm more of a dog person than a baby person. No judgment, but like I have dogs. I don't have children. So the dog one is the better idea, obviously. So unfortunately, that's
Also,
I
like
don't
dog cast. There's something there.
a dog
Podcast,
cast,
dog cast. No, okay.
A pod.
a pup cast.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, there we go. All right. Anyway, yeah, but again, like featuring a bunch of people who you wouldn't necessarily think, or maybe people that don't have like super polished podcast rooms in their house. Like Devon's got this super polished
exactly.
soundproofing, but I just got like a big old mess. So, those kinds of things. I like it. I think that brings these, hopefully helps people know how they can create the best ideas ever just from one simple perception. That's all we have. Thanks, Devon and Jenny, for coming in here and helping everyone tell better stories. I expect to see only amazing content that is so clearly ladders up to perceptions in the future from anyone who's ever listened to this podcast. Thanks again.